morning, everybody, and happy International Women's Day for tomorrow. I've been amazed at the amount of energy and fantastic events that have taken place this week celebrating this important day. Indeed, yesterday we celebrated our own International Women's Day and awarded some of our most talented women across the globe with various recognitions, and that was really inspiring. But my highlight this week is having the privilege to be here with you today and to introduce Baroness Ashton. We've come a long way since the first International Women's Day in 1911. We've been to the moon, we've got the vote, we've had a female Prime Minister, and Baroness Ashton is someone who's really truly inspiring the next generation of female leaders. But more than that, the theme for this year's International Women's Day, as you know, is inspiring change. And I think the very work that she does embodies that theme for this year. So we are all incredibly grateful for you taking time out of your hectic schedule. We can only imagine how busy your to-do list is at the moment. And on behalf of everybody here, I would like to just say a big thank you and say how much we're looking forward to you sharing your perspectives. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, Cathy, a busy week. So what's your week been like so far?
Not what I expected it to be, which is quite normal. Sunday was spent getting the Foreign Affairs Council ready, which was an emergency council because of the situation in Ukraine. Monday I chaired the council for 7 or 8 hours and then did the press afterwards. And then I was in Madrid to meet with my counterpart, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, for what was a very, as I described it, interesting occasion. And then on to Paris to join with John Kerry and with other foreign ministers to try and work closely with the Ukrainian foreign minister and with the Russians to establish a kind of contact group. Then from there, I think I got back to Brussels at 3 in the morning and had the European Council, which I, of course, am the only non-head of state who attends and who, therefore, it falls to me to brief the Council on that. And then I came to London late last night and I go to Tehran in the morning for the first visit to Iran and then on to Oman and Sarajevo.
Right. Precisely. On that basis, I think I've worked out you haven't slept in the same bed 2 nights running.
In fact, I think there are 2 weeks of the year, or possibly 3, when I sleep in the same bed for a week. Yeah.
Can I go back a bit? Because I'll raise something on Ukraine later in our conversation towards the end to obviously address that. Your first 20 years after you graduated, you worked in the voluntary sector, business in the community, and so on, before you became a life peer, then a minister. What were the development of skills in that area? Because you come from Lancashire, from a mining background, male-dominated traditionally, not many women miners. But what were the skills you developed in that period, in a sense, in your 20s and 30s?
Well, like many women of my generation, I was the only girl in my family to go to university. So that's the first thing. And from that, I decided that I, like many people, didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I didn't sit down saying, oh, I'd like to be the first High Representative of the European Union. So I decided that I would try and work in all 3 sectors. And I worked in the voluntary sector, the private sector, and then the public sector. And from that, I decided that the things that I probably thought I could do more of were around, if you like, bringing people together. And the business and the community work, which is, in a sense, the first thing that I was kind of invited to come and do, was about building partnerships between public, private and voluntary sector organisations, taking, if you like, the best of each and putting that together into a framework that meant we could help some of the most deprived communities in Britain. And I suppose from each sector you learn different things. You learn the rigour that can be in the private sector. You learn the disciplines of the public sector where you're constantly referencing back to democracy and democratically elected bodies one way or the other. And in the voluntary sector you learn that you have to do things on a shoestring and you have to develop your interpersonal skills because building in the voluntary sector is about people.
which clearly all were useful later on. And we'll come.
Yeah.
Then you went to the House of Lords. Now, I think one of the most interesting things is, and actually it'll make the subject of a thesis, was the dominance on the Labour benches in the Lords of women, many of whom had had a kind of parallel, I wouldn't say similar background to you, working in the voluntary sector, working in the public sector, working in the private sector. And there were 4 women leaders of the Lords during the Labour years in power, as well as a number of other distinguished women holding ministerial jobs. I mean, this is totally contrary to most people's preconception of the Lords. What skills do you develop there, or were some of the skills you developed prior to that useful in the Lords?
I think incredibly useful in the Lords. And actually the group of women, when I was leader of the Lords, the front bench was 50-50, men and women. And some of the most extraordinary women, on all benches, by the way, this is not a Labour point, it's on all benches, because they had had incredible careers and had either reached the point where they had been snatched by leaders, whether they were prime ministers or leaders of the opposition, to form that group of people from whom they could find ministers willing to take on the responsibilities in the Lords, which are huge. Or people who'd reached the point in their career where they wanted to be in some form of public service, and the Lords was a way of doing that. So these were extraordinary women by definition. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them had made a very conscious decision that though they clearly had an interest in political life, they didn't want to go the route of the Commons. They didn't want to go through that particular experience of being selected, which many MPs, men and women, can talk about at length, no doubt. That actually they were not interested in that. And so they pursued their careers and lives while retaining that interest in politics, and came in via a different route.
Yeah, but doesn't that say an awful lot about some of the processes to get selected in the Commons? Because after all, in parallel, Labour had gone to all-women shortlists, and there was a massive leap in 1997 in the number of women Labour MPs. So that some of was it that some of the disincentives had applied at an earlier stage to women?
Well, I also think, I can't speak for all of them, for any means, but speaking for myself, I never wanted to be an MP. I mean, I think quite a lot of the women in the Lords hadn't wanted to be a member of Parliament. They were very interested in politics and in policy, and had a lot to contribute in that way, but they didn't see themselves as a constituency MP for a whole variety of reasons. That may be to do with the particular way that it's organised, and the workload, or all of the things that we generally assume about women's lives. Or it may just have been that the House of Commons didn't appeal to them at that point in their life when they'd have had to make that decision. And so the Lords, because it's by definition people who are well established, sometimes that means older, by the way. I like well established. Well established. Then they can make the choice perhaps from a different set of criteria than you can when you're younger and trying to work out how you're going to position yourself.
What about the skills which you had to deploy in the Lords itself? We've got a former deputy leader of the Lords here, now in a different role. What were the skills you had to deploy there?
Well, you ask him probably. Tom McNally's there, and Andrew's there, the others, I think.
Okay, yeah.
And Elspeth, I can see Elspeth Howard there, it's great.
An ability to charm old men.
I mean, when I was a minister in the Lords, and then leader of the Lords for the Labour Party in government, we had 22% of the vote. That means whether it's charming you, Tom, or whether it's actually finding a way through with either Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, or the crossbenchers, you had to have an alliance somewhere if you were going to win the vote. And the opposition's job is to try and find ways in which you don't have that alliance and make you lose the vote. And a lot of the work, therefore, in the Lords is, I think it's two things. One, you have to know and understand your bill inside out. But I slightly digress, but the first time I was taking a bill through, I'd been a minister for a very short period of time. In the Lords, I took an education bill through. I faced opposite me 5 former Secretaries of State, the former head of Ofsted, God knows how many permanent secretaries, junior ministers, vice-chancellors, experts on education. I remember looking and thinking, oh my God. And they knew every trick I was about to try and deploy about the information I'd been given. They knew how parliamentary draftsmen worked. They knew the people in the box and what they were going to give me. And I can remember very, very famously being given a slip of paper in the middle of a very heated debate about the detail of a bill from the officials, and it just said, "You're on your own." And I was. So you have to both have, you know, that grasp of detail. And in the Lords, detail matters. If you know what you're talking about, people will change sides. They will actually go with you on an amendment if they believe what you say. So it's not about simply saying anything and knowing the vote will be with you. You have to be able to argue. And then I think the other thing is to put the work in to prepare the bill. So I invited always the opposition, the crossbenchers and the Liberal Democrats who were going to be leading on the bill to come to be briefed on the bill by my officials. Because a more informed front bench, the better were the chances that we could find a way through. And the easier it would be to avoid what you might call silly amendments that we would then be defeated on, but actually we could have avoided. Was there anything in, you talked about the number of women, which actually gave you an advantage, given that atmosphere in the Lords, which was, in order to succeed, you couldn't be adversarial. You had to bring people along, as you say. You had to build coalitions because you didn't have the majority votes. Was there anything in what you'd done, say, in the voluntary sector, or is there a distinctive female style of operating in politics which actually plays to the advantage in the Lords? I'm always nervous about the distinctive female bit. I think women are different to men, by the way, but I've seen men in the Lords do equally, if not better, jobs than I've done in terms of what they can deliver. So I'm not going to go into that trap. And as I always say, there are not enough women out there in senior positions to know whether it's a female trait or it's just by a particular individual style. I think the nature of the Lords attracts people to it who don't want to have that kind of adversarial approach. Certainly not something I like. But who are willing to engage in the kind of detailed argument. And sometimes, the debates could be unbelievably dreadful, but were breathtakingly good on many cases. I can remember sitting through some of the best debates on issues, for example, like stem cell research, where the Lords was absolutely incredible to listen to, because you had every opinion, but you also had every level of expertise too. Now, I remember, I think last time we had a long conversation was on Manchester Piccadilly Station in October 2008, when we were talking about the Lisbon Treaty Bill. Your life changed rather dramatically over the following week. You first became Trade Commissioner when Peter Mandelson came back here. But you hadn't actually done an enormous amount of international stuff as a minister or in your background. How much of a big adjustment it was to become Trade Commissioner, which you held for just over a year? Well, I mean, just to sort of rewind for a second, I mean, it was my idea that I would take the Lisbon Treaty through. Because I felt that I knew as much as anybody about how to get legislation through the Lords. And as leader, it was also demonstrating this was a really important treaty. I joke that maybe I'd look back on that slightly differently now.
Yes, very few people take legislation through to finding their job description.
Exactly. I might have perhaps, added a few things in there if I'd not. I'd actually been, when I was at the, now the Ministry of Justice, as it now is, I was the minister who had responsibility for Europe. So I'd actually spent quite a bit of time at Justice and Home Affairs Councils, as they're called, and meeting with my counterparts in justice across the European Union. And the council works in a way that's actually, in a sort of strange way, a bit like a mini House of Lords, because it's about building alliances for things. It's just that you're doing it across the member states of the European Union. So Brussels and the councils and that kind of work was very familiar to me. So that part of it was, if you like, straightforward. The taking on the trade brief, there were two things that were very important. One is understanding the jargon of trade. I chaired a health authority, so I remember the moment when I could talk and sound like I really did understand the jargon of health. Well, the jargon of trade is even worse, non-tariff barriers and goodness knows what else. You have to learn it. And then the second is how you deploy what you know in trying to get agreements. But again, you're back to the same skill set. I did the trade deal with South Korea, which is the biggest we've ever done, and is what I call a 21st century trade deal because it's a kind of new type. Hugely important for this country, hugely beneficial economically. But when I was dealing with the South Korean trade minister, the skills I was using were not terribly different. The language I was talking was very different.
Then, a year later, you become the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice President of the Commission, and so on. Now, you're creating a new job. How did you create a new job out of a number of previous ones? I mean, you were kind of pulling together a number of jobs and with quite, with difficult expectations. What would this job involve?
Yes, I think my chef de cabinet is here, James, has been with me from day one of this, and we were actually talking about this together not long ago, about remembering back as I come to the end of my time in office, the very beginnings of it. I think there are many reasons why people looked to me for this job, some of them positive, some of them negative. One of them was that I understood how Brussels worked and how the Commission worked, and the Vice President of the Commission part was important for this. And because I'd done the big trade deal and was well known in many countries across the world, and also by the member states, because I'd had to get all of them to sign up to the trade agreements I'd reached and report to them, I was a much more known quantity, really, in that sense. But the job combines three jobs that were full-time before. The person who did all the external work for the Commission and who looked after all of the ways in which we engage with the world externally, bringing together commissioners from development, climate change, trade, and so on, but having that overview and having responsibility for resources that are spent. The High Representative job, which had been done by Javier Solana, which was representing the member states together, where they agreed across the world. But adding into all of that, the role of the rotating presidency. Presidency moves every 6 months, which would chair the Foreign Affairs Council, chair the Development Council, chair the Defence Council, and would be responsible for making sure there was a common policy and an approach in the world. So these were three people who spent their whole time travelling, different parts of the world, doing slightly different things, in some cases very different things, all brought together in one place, which at one level makes a lot of sense, but the bringing together of it required institutionally everything to change and to come into one. And I'll give you the example that I use, which is about Somalia. When I took on the responsibility, I wanted to bring together into one room the people who are commanding the ships who are preventing piracy off the coast of Somalia. And that's a fleet called Atalanta. It is an EU-based fleet, works closely with other countries. 95% reduction in piracy is largely down to the work that they have done. Its headquarters are in Northwood, just outside of London, but it's run by the EU, and it falls to my political responsibility. I wanted to bring together the people who are working on supporting the government, the fledgling government in Somalia, after 20 years of civil war, on reforming the justice sector, trying to build the institutions of government. And I wanted to bring together the people doing development programs in the country. All of the people I'm talking about, with the exception of the admiral who ran Atalanta, were based in Brussels. They had never met each other because they were all run by different parts of the organisations. And it wasn't that they were doing things contradictory or that I'm trying to say something that's not actually true in many government departments in national governments, but it was just fascinating that when I brought them all together, we had never had a strategic or what I call a comprehensive approach to anything. So first part of the job was trying to bring these three jobs into one. Second, and perhaps biggest, was there is one line in the treaty which says the High Representative Vice President will be supported by an external action service. And that had to be created from nothing. So when I began and when the Haiti earthquake happened, which was one of the very first crises we had to deal with, I had half a private office, a cabinet, and lots of people in 8 different buildings who were going to one day be part of this service, who in theory worked to my role one way or the other, but not in any way as a unified group. And one of the biggest things, and it now exists, it has, I designed the logo. It has a logo, didn't cost anything. It has a building, which we have, and everybody's in the same building, and the delegations across the world now work under one system together. But that was a huge effort.
What about particularly because you were building a capability, a voice in areas which went way beyond what the previous individual ones did, relations with national governments on that? Because many of them would regard it, hold on, that's our thing, and that's very intergovernmental, and...
Yeah, I mean, because the treaty had been so long in the making, and there were many moments when it was by no means certain that the treaty would exist. We'd had the constitution, which had fallen down by the referendums in France and the Netherlands. Now you'd had Ireland voting. No, you'd had all of that. The group of ministers that I met when I chaired my first council, some of them were not as familiar with the Lisbon Treaty as certainly I was. And I think for many of them, it wasn't hostility, it was more curiosity. Yeah. Curiosity to know why I was in this seat and perhaps that they weren't, or curiosity that what did this mean for their own role. But, this is about bringing it all together. It's not about doing what they do. And I think, and I hope over time, we've now got a fantastic working relationship with all member states.
Now, quite often you would have been one of a handful of women in the room of 27, what now, 28 countries. Did that make any difference at all?
There's a very famous moment in my life when I was chairing the Foreign Affairs Council, and everybody, all the ministers sit around the table, and I had 2 officials either side, and I was the only woman. And one of the foreign ministers said, "Cathy, do you realise you're the only woman in the room?" And I said, "It doesn't matter, I'm in charge." And what was very funny was I then went that week to a couple of member state capitals where this had obviously been reported back in some telegram because there were references to being in charge. It is very often the case that there are only very few women. The European Council, you only have a few women leaders. They're very important leaders. You have Chancellor Merkel there, for example. Yeah. And on the Foreign Affairs Council, I think we have 3, including me, presently. When you get to defence ministers, as you and I were just saying before, we're actually seeing an increase in the number of women defence ministers, because I chair those, and development ministers, as I chair all those councils through the year. You don't find that many women in foreign policy ministerial positions, that's for sure.
No, I mean, and also when you're looking at some of the trickier issues you dealt with, say in the Middle East, where it's not just whatever reasons there aren't many women foreign ministers and defence ministers in Europe, but the political culture is what is in many of the countries you've dealt with isn't exactly promoting women to prominent places. In many respects, it's positively hostile to women being in public places. How did that affect your ability to negotiate with these regimes?
Not at all, as far as I can see. I mean, first of all, most countries across the world have one way or another dealt with women in particular roles, whether that's as heads of state and government, whether that's as ministers. And whether they, for their own people, take a view, they take a view that you are the representation. And the fact that you are a woman is not part of that. Whenever I travel, I try and meet with women's groups. I will do that tomorrow night in Tehran. The first group of people I will meet, because we want to celebrate International Women's Day, will be a group of Iranian women. And everywhere that I go, whether it's into Egypt or any other countries going through change, we will always have meetings with, I will always have meetings with women.
I remember when we had Valerie Amos here last October, one point Valerie made was, that in fact when she was a minister, when she was African minister and so on, Tony Blair used to send her to deal with some slightly unsavoury leaders in parts of sub-Saharan Africa who weren't prominent in their feminist approach to politics. But Valerie reckoned that actually they were a bit frightened of her. They couldn't bully her, when they might have bullied a male minister, that because she was so different from them, it actually gave her an advantage.
I think that's a very interesting thing, and you know, I think Valerie may well have something there actually. That the possibility exists that because you are different, you have made it impossible for them to treat you in quite the way they would if you were a man in that situation. It's very possible that that's true. Very possible.
The other thing, given your role, not being elected, you're surrounded by elected foreign ministers. How does that alter things? I mean, it obviously gives you a longer perspective, because I mean, you will have outlasted all but a handful of foreign ministers in the period you've been in the job, and which has obviously clear advantages in knowledge and all that. But does it make a difference, the fact you're not elected in the popular sense of the term, when you're operating with people who are elected? I mean, I was thinking particularly in the council.
Well, to be in my job, I have to have two things. One is I had to be appointed by the council, which was the heads of state and government, which I was done unanimously. And then I had to be elected by the European Parliament. They have to vote. So you do go through a sort of machinery. But the way that I've interpreted this job, because being the first, you have to try and, again, build the organisation, which takes a huge amount of time and energy, to simply do things like work out which carpets you're going to put in. There's only you that has those decisions in the end. And I made decisions. You know, the colour of the furniture in the building is the colour that I chose. Oh, I hope the next person likes it, because I think it's all right. But, you know, there's only you to decide how it's going to be, whether it's open plan or not, all of that. The most important thing I felt I had to do was to build a relationship, particularly with the foreign ministers, where they could feel that this was about a team leader and not somebody trying to impose upon them. I do put forward my views. I put forward all the proposals for the council's conclusions. But it's a process of collaboration, because it's only by unanimity that we work. And the Foreign Affairs Council has always reached decisions. We've managed, in some quite difficult discussions, not least recently, to actually reach a conclusion that is not lowest common denominator, but actually is a positive and strong decision.
I was also thinking another aspect, that because you're not having to look to a domestic electorate, and you've got a fairly defined, you've got a defined term of the job, it enables you also to play things longer than you might if you were an elected politician. I mean, all right, there are some fixtures like Carl Bildt and some of the others who've been around, on that, but in general, it gives you an ability to look at a different time horizon. I just wondered how much that played in, particularly with Iran, where it wasn't, to say the least, a sudden overnight progress, to put it mildly. Does that make a difference, that you can adopt a different approach?
I would imagine it probably does. I mean, again, back to the Lords, it's a bit like Lords ministers don't change as often as Commons ministers, partly because there's a smaller group to choose from, and also because actually a lot of people in the Lords do not want to be ministers. So governments and opposition have a few people to choose from. So you tend to have a longevity in the Lords that you don't perhaps have in the Commons. That means you perhaps think a bit longer. But there were always going to be, for me, if this job was going to prove to be worthwhile, I knew there were a number of things I had to do. One is the Foreign Affairs Council had to function and function well. And you don't hear people coming out of the council saying that was terrible. It is a united group. That the relationships of this role to all 28 ministers are strong, and they feel treated equally. That's also important. but it also had to be about delivering some things that were going to take longer to get ready. Serbia, Kosovo, Iran. Some of the things that we're now working on have been because I built relationships with people over lots of time. The relationships we have in Egypt, where I think I've been 16 times to Egypt now, and I'll be back. It's just that other things have obviously taken priority. But all of the relationships we have are built over that period of time in order that you've got a chance of being able to deliver. And leading the Iran talks or deciding to do the Serbia-Kosovo talks, I knew it was going to be about a huge amount of personal investment, as well as, of course, all the tools that you've got at your disposal.
No, I mean, you just raised a very interesting point, prioritising. You could easily, I mean, and I'm sure looking at your chef de cabinet, fill your diary with a dozen issues, all of which are important and are regarded by the countries concerned as vitally important. How on earth do you prioritise that? I mean, obviously there's things like Ukraine, which will come to in a minute, which will hit you in the face and you've just got to do. But how do you balance out the rest?
Well, there are three big priorities I set at the beginning. One was to set up a service of which people in the European Union could be proud. Secondly, to recognise that people would judge whether Europe, as a kind of combination of the might of 28 nations, was how effective it was in its own neighbourhood, south and east. And thirdly, we needed to build strategic partnerships, because most of what we do, we don't do alone. We do it with the UN or the United States, or with groupings of nations coming together through the Security Council or wherever, Arab League, Africa Union, and so on. So those were my three big priorities, and those are the three, that when I finish in October, I will look back on and, if you like, judge myself, never mind, no doubt, be judged by. That meant that there were very clear things I had to focus on, particularly in the neighbourhood. It's also, of course, true that just as we got the service, day one of the service was January 2011, you know what happened in Tunisia and then later in the rest of that part of the world, Libya, Egypt, and so on. For the prioritisation of day-to-day, there are things that I have in my head. The Iran talks are now ongoing. We started them for a comprehensive agreement. Serbia, Kosovo, we've done the first agreement, we're now looking for the second. I'm off to Bosnia-Herzegovina because there are real problems about them being stuck, in a sense. Egypt and so on. So the neighbourhood issues always come top. But last week I was talking with Secretary Kerry about Venezuela and what we could do together in the Human Rights Council in Geneva and issues of that nature. For every member state of the European Union, there is a historic or a geopolitical reason why they focus on different parts of the world. So you always have to have a sense of what's going on absolutely everywhere, and be prepared that might become your priority of tomorrow.
I mean, two things on that. One, is there a danger of, I mean, you are a very important person within the European Union and in the Brussels setup, to put it simply. But because you're travelling all the time, is there a danger of losing touch, despite the office, your cabinet and all that? Because you're thinking, right, if I spend a bit more time talking to the Iranians, we're going to make some progress, aren't we? Because you have made very big progress and all that. Another trip to Egypt or another that. You can lose touch with the sense of the people you're working with. Because as you say, you've got to retain the confident support of the 28 foreign ministers. Isn't there a danger of that? Because repeated foreign secretaries, our next door neighbour, William Hague, have always said that there's a danger of losing touch with the base, almost.
I think I've got two base points, really. One is the Commission, and trying to be an effective commissioner. I don't miss important Commission meetings. Commission meetings are every week, every Wednesday for 4 hours. Sometimes they're about orientation discussions. Other times they are trying to make serious discussions about particular issues, and I try very hard not to miss those important ones. I also try and schedule what we call Brussels time, because I also appoint every head of delegation, the equivalent of an ambassador, myself. I felt that was important to do, and most foreign ministers don't do that, I do. So I have to interview people for those positions. And I also have responsibilities because I'm the person responsible for the whole organisation. So I have to worry about staff regulations and whether my team have met with the trade unions. And I have to appear before the European Parliament as well, quite often, and the committees of the European Parliament. And I'm also the representative at NATO, so I have to go to NATO Defence and Foreign Ministers meeting. I think somebody calculated there are 300 meetings a year before I actually leave and do anything. So you have to have base time, simply because there are requirements on the job.
Now, the other thing you mentioned was John Kerry, Secretary of State. Now, you work with two very strong American Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. The famous, do they regard you as the answer to the Kissinger question of 73? Who do I ring up in Europe?
I once asked Henry Kissinger, he said he never said that. There's a very funny joke about this, which I will repeat, which I used to use at the beginning. You know, when you start something, everybody thinks that you're going to, within 2 minutes, demonstrate its value. And part of the reason that I got hammered so much was because people thought, well, where is it? Well, it wasn't anywhere. We were just beginning. And the joke, and I told this, I think, to the Russian foreign minister at the time, is that you imagine that Hillary Clinton goes into, this was in the days of Hillary, goes in to see the president and says, Mr. President, I have good news. At last we have a phone number for Europe. And the president says, that's fantastic, Hillary. Let's call it up. So Hillary rings my mobile. And they get my voicemail, and it says, hello, welcome to the Europe. For the French position, press 1.
Yeah.
We've come a long way since then. Now I can give you the European position for sure. I think what I would say to that is that with both of them, I was in regular contact. With Secretary Kerry, it's every couple of days probably, one way or the other. And there are many things where it's obviously the connection is with the European Union. If you're looking at how to support him in the Middle East peace process, it's the weight of Europe to support Israel and the Palestinian Authority into this agreement. If it's the work we do together on Iran, I am named by the Security Council as the chief negotiator. If it's talking about Venezuela, as we were doing, or if it's on Ukraine, then obviously there is a strong and deep connection. But that does not, for one moment, take away from the strength of the relationship that John Kerry will have with William, or the relationship that clearly President Obama has with Prime Minister Cameron. I mean, it's not, and you could repeat that for Germany or Italy or whatever, it's not a competition. It's actually about when you want to say, this is about what can the EU do. And what I can give him, and what I gave Hillary, was I can tell them where the EU will be. I know where the 28 countries will go on any issue pretty much, at any time. I can weigh the balance now because I know what will happen. And if it's not me that they need, I would say so. I'd say, look, actually, this is an issue that isn't going to play into the EU agenda, but it is going to be really important for this country or that country. And I'll steer them in that direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, that touches on, I mean, are there things which the EU can't do? Or are there crises? I mean, we can think of two particular ones, Syria and Ukraine, where, frankly, there are limits because of the nature of the situation, where you could try and do something, but there are quite severe limits on the ability to deliver or achieve anything.
Well, I think there are two things I'd separate in that. One is where there are discussions about military action. I bring together ministers of defence. There are military staff in Brussels. They are my military advisors, and I'm responsible for troops across the world who work under an EU flag. But we are not a fast responder. Any troop deployment is done by the amalgamation of 28 countries agreeing that that's what they're going to do. Normally it's in peacekeeping in any event, or in things like off the coast of Somalia preventing piracy. And that, by definition, the rules of engagement, the mission plan and so on is never going to be done the speed with which an individual nation can decide to deploy. Second, and something I personally feel, is if you send men and women into harm's way, you should be an elected government making that choice. It's not for me.
Yeah.
National governments, sovereignty matters hugely in defence issues. But there are things, again, we can do together that really matters. So when you think about Syria, a lot of the conversations were in the initial stages about how to support the opposition, how to stop Bashar al-Assad from doing what he was doing. And we were engaged in a lot of diplomatic efforts, and still are. I still have teams going into Damascus quietly. We still have many pieces of work, because the other thing, which you know very well from your many years as a journalist, is a lot of this stuff is under the radar. And too often, the stuff that's above the radar is the kind of heavy, hard power efforts. So if you're not moving around flying planes, somehow it seems like you're not doing anything, when actually we're doing a huge amount. And we've been very engaged in helping to support Geneva II and the work of Lakhdar Brahimi in trying to bring the two sides together, and many other things that I, for obvious reasons, can't talk about now.
Just on Syria there, of course, also the UN, how do you liaise with the UN? Because that's some people you haven't really mentioned so far.
We work very closely with the UN. I would say the European Union is the biggest supporter of the UN, and with Ban Ki-moon, who I work with a lot, and his team, we are in constant touch. We have a team in New York, and every night, overnight, I get a New York briefing of where we are in our discussions with the UN. The UN and we work together on Libya. I formed a group for Libya, which was the Arab League, Africa Union, United Nations and the EU, to deliver on some of the longer term issues. There are huge challenges in Libya, I would say now, for sure, but we're now looking at how we can rebuild that and work together. We work with the UN across the world, and Valerie Amos and I meet very regularly in all sorts of different international fora to look at how we can support countries in crisis. Central African Republic is, for Ban Ki-moon, very high on his agenda. We're looking at how we can deploy support to that mission. Ukraine,
after this week, how do you see where we are now?
I think this is a difficult situation. The Prime Minister of Ukraine, and a man called Arseniy Yatsenyuk, was in Brussels yesterday. For the first time in my time in office, we invited a non-EU Prime Minister to come to meet all of the Prime Ministers in session. There are very challenging times ahead in terms of trying to ensure the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Something upon which, in my discussions with Russia, we have always agreed, and ensuring that this sovereign nation can make its own choices about its future. The government in Kiev is properly constituted under the Ukrainian constitution. President Yanukovych, who I've met many, many times before this crisis turned out the way it has, to try and persuade him that he needed to respond to what was happening in the streets of Kiev, and spent many, many hours with him on this, and to understand that ordinary people, because that's who they were in Maidan, the square in Kiev, were wanting him to explain why he wasn't signing the agreement with the EU, but more importantly by then, to really reach out to them and to stop the violence that was happening on the streets, for sure. You will see that the European Council has taken some measures yesterday, and also explained that other things will happen. We are busy working on trying to find a diplomatic way through this. That's what I was doing in Paris, what I was doing in Rome, and what we'll no doubt be doing for a lot of next week as well, in order to try and get negotiations to end this in a way that the people of Ukraine can go forward.
Do you think the Russians understand the concern of other people? Because you've talked to Prime Minister Lavrov.
Foreign Minister Lavrov, yes. There are different perspectives on Ukraine. There are different approaches depending on whether you see this country as fundamentally part of your sphere of influence, And there are different groups within the country who, understandably right now, are very nervous about where the direction of the country will be. For the European Union and Russia, this is not a competition, and this is my loudest message that I've been saying to Prime Minister Lavrov. We're not in competition with each other. Ukraine needs a good and strong relationship with Russia. Businesses in the East trade to a large extent, if not exclusively, with Russia. This is not about them not being part of Ukraine's future, but that's different to this nation not being able to make its own decisions about the way it wishes to go forward. And that's, I think, where we've got to get to.
You mentioned, of course, you will cease in the job 6 months' time, 7 months' time. And I'm not sure if I see a look of relief or anything else on your face. And it's probably too early for reflection, but in a sense, do you think you brought a distinctive style which would be different from, as I say, going back to that point of elected politician who would operate slightly differently, by patience, by building relationships? Has it been a different approach? Or is it an inevitable one framed by the nature of the job as High Representative?
I think the first person to do it has a different job to everybody else, because the first person to do it has to make sure that there is a second person. Okay? That's the first thing. There will be a second person. The second thing that I had to do was build an institution. For the first time in 50 years, there was a creation of a new thing in Brussels by ripping bits off other institutions, which is never easy, and bringing people into post. Because I didn't start with a blank piece of paper. I started with people who had to be found jobs in a new structure, and then bringing in member state diplomats new to this. And there was no system for doing that. It didn't exist. Should they be interviewed? Should they be? All of that had to be created. So all of that is done. It will need to be developed. It's not, it's not finished, but the basis of it is there. So the next High Representative will arrive in an office with an organisation that is functioning, and with delegations, 140 of them across the world, including new delegations opened in Libya, opened in Burma, and a set of relationships that function. We did a review of the service last year, and I wrote down some things I thought should change in the short, medium and long term. So I've left that for that to also be part of how the new person will come in. And I'm determined that they will have the best possible start with the organisation by making or dealing with all the bits and pieces I can. But that's inevitable for the first job. The next person will take it to a new level. They'll do probably greater things. They'll do different things. They will face different challenges than the ones I did. For me, it was about the Arab Spring. It was about our relations in our neighbourhood. It was about building the strength of the service. They will face a different set of challenge, and I wish them every possible success.
Now, we've got time, because it's, Cathy's very kindly agreed to have 2 or 3 questions from the floor. Because it's International Women's Day, we're only going to take women and about women leaders. So, women leaders, question, Miranda.
Don't look outraged. We women have put up with this for years. Now you know what it feels like.
Miranda.
I'm thrilled.
Miranda Curtis, I'm a trustee of the Institute for Government. It's my experience that if you have the opportunity to operate across the international stage at extremely senior level, whether in business or in the world of global politics, and in particular if you are a pioneer and you are a woman pioneer, that's a unique experience that is intensely demanding, intensely energizing, intensely exhilarating, intensely exhausting, and ultimately very addictive. As you start to contemplate the end of your term in office, have you thought about how you're going to come off that intellectual and professional high, and what the next chapter in your career might involve? How do you follow this fantastic act?
I don't look at it in the way you do. I think that this has been an extraordinary experience, but it has been an experience of trying to deal with some of the most difficult problems that have altered the face of our world. And in so many ways, you don't get the exhilaration, perhaps, that you might do in a different framework. Because when, for example, when we got the interim agreement with Iran, I was just really tired because we've done 4 days and nights, but it was 3.5 years, and we have a lot more to do. So a lot of this is about constantly trying to make sure that you're doing the best that you possibly can, and always wondering whether you've got it right, whether it could be better, whether you've put enough into it, and so on. So it's more about that the pressure on yourself to get this right in these circumstances is enormous. So for me, the end of it will be about doing some stuff that I haven't done for a long time. Holiday is number one. I mean, I haven't done that for a very, very long time because you can't. And going somewhere where you can just be. So I don't think about what the next thing is at all. I just think about there'll come a moment when this will not be something that I have to do, and where I can then perhaps contemplate what I might do next.
Yeah, you're not coming around, yeah. We'll group a couple together now, yeah.
Sally Mugridge. I was Chief Executive of the Industry and Parliament Trust when you were mooted for being the higher representative. I'm now a Church Commissioner, by the way. Just to say that I was amazed, having taken so many groups to Europe, to Brussels particularly, how many MEPs queried your skills in a way that I thought was extraordinary. It wouldn't have been the same if it had been a male person. And one of the comments I remember said, well, we don't know her, but we'll give her a fair hearing. And I would just like to say that the feedback was very positive afterwards, but I thought, bearing in mind we're talking about women leaders, it was extraordinary, that wealth of feeling and interest and possible criticism that I thought was just something that wouldn't have happened if it had been a male candidate.
Yeah. We'll take, I think, lady by the door, Lauren.
I just want, my name is Irina Tandura, I'm Ukrainian, I live and work in London. I just wanted to thank you for continued effort and the dialogue. All of us Ukrainians who live in London and in the UK, we obviously are very concerned, focused, and do all we can, but also are grateful for all your dialogue and efforts, and we're really hopeful that there will be peace in Crimea and in Ukraine, and perhaps you'll come on holiday to Crimea soon, so that's a great destination. So, thank you.
Right, one last question. Lady there, next.
My name's Jane Sharp, and my life is all international relations, war and peace. And I just want to congratulate you on moving the thing with Iran forward. I think it's been such a block for so many years that I just think that's amazing. And I do think a lot of us credit you with that. I think it's just the way you do things. And my question is, Iran is now a little bit not on the front page, and I'm wondering if you see that as an advantage for moving forward? Or is it, do you move forward more when everybody's focused on it, or is it easier if you can just step back a little bit?
The way we do the Iran talks, which again is something that I invented, if you like, is to be away for 2 or 3 days together. When I first took on this role, the meetings were very short, 2 or 3 hours every few months, which I didn't think would work. And taking 2 or 3 days means that you've got time to both have the press flurry at the beginning and at the end, but you can actually be locked away to try and work through some of these difficult issues with a bit more time, technically and politically. It's very important that people understand the deal is not yet done. We've done something which will stop things moving further for 6 months. That runs out in July. And if you follow what's happening in the American Congress, or you follow what's happening in the Iranian Parliament, getting an extension of that will be very difficult unless there's really significant progress. There are technical talks going on right now between Iran and the E3+3, technical people led by my expert. And we will be back in Vienna for the next round of talks the week after next. So it needs to be on the front page in people's mind. It needs to not be considered done. I hope that we'll make some progress very soon.
I'm afraid we've got to close it there because you've got to dash off on your crowded programme on that. Well, at least you've had a holiday tip out of it. Whether it was the immediate top one, I'm less sure on that. After Teddy Roosevelt was president, he went big game shooting on safari for 6 months. So there's always that, to many of the countries you regularly visit, actually. So there are all kinds of ways, or we could go and paint and all that.
No, I know what I'm going to do, don't worry.
Yeah, we will indeed. But thank you very much indeed for giving up your time, for being so open about and so fascinating about creating the job you've created. And I look forward to bumping into you on a railway station to discover what you're going to do next. So on behalf of, and also I'd like to thank EY for sponsoring this whole series of Women's Leaders events. Absolutely fascinating one. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.